Everyone loves a good mummy, from vintage Universal monsters to the swashbuckling Brendan Fraser, and even Tom Cruise once. The mythology of the mummy holds considerable power over our imagination, but none of those fearsome old bones can hold a candle to one of the spookiest mummies ever discovered. This tale will not put a smile on your face, but it might be good for a scream. So, today we're telling the horrifying story behind the screaming mummy. But before we get all wrapped up in the details, why don't you shuffle over to the subscribe button? Then let us know in the comments what other ancient Egyptian stories you want to hear about. For now, I scream, you scream, we all scream for history. The mummy that would come to be known as the Screaming Mummy was discovered by Egyptologist Gaston Maspero in 1886. It was only recently that the stiff, known as Unknown Man-E, became a tourist attraction. Audiences formed a morbid kind of curiosity about the mummy based on the grim nature of his demise and the expression of fear, frozen on his face for all eternity. Scholars had puzzled for decades trying to understand why he passed looking like he did. But a recent display at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo gave national attention to these roaring remains. The museum director noted that before the exhibit, Man-E, no relation to Eazy-E, had spent most of his time abandoned in the basement, gathering dust. Well, more dust. Is there a dust threshold after a few thousand years? Once he was brought upstairs, the Screaming Mummy lured over 20,000 visitors to the museum, receiving international press coverage to boot, which is more than we can say for the Mummy 3, Tomb of the Dragon Emperor. The only thing scarier than cracking open an old wooden box and coming face to face with a mummy is turning to your right or left and being completely surrounded by mummies. And the archaeologists who discovered the Screaming Mummy had to put on their bravest faces to reckon with the fact that their excavation site was filled with dead bodies. The group's resting place was found at Deir el-Bahri near the Valley of the Kings. Many of these mummies had identification attached to them. Poor Man-E, however, had no such name tag. The fact that he was buried amongst so many royal mummies suggests that he may have been of royal blood, unless he sprung to life like a Halloween special and dragged himself to fancier digs. But his wrappings were a fashion disaster, made from sheepskin, an uncharacteristically impure form of wrapping, usually reserved for heavy offenders or people damned for eternity. The Egyptians were straight up obsessed with purity. It's also a big deal to leave the label off someone's tomb, as that means they could never be named in the afterlife. Whoever presided over this mummification also bound the hands and feet, as if he had died a prisoner. Finally, the whole mummification process appears to have been a rush job, as the process, typically drawn out, was reduced to a quick drying out of the body with natron and some resin placed in the mouth, proving that you can have it done fast or have it done right, but never both. Also, who on earth did this guy piss off? Well... So here's a theory as to who our Man-E is. During the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses III, one of the king's sons, Prince Pentaweret, as well as one of Ramesses' minor wives, harem member Tai, conspired to remove him and the next heir in succession. This would allow Pentaweret to rise to the throne. The plan didn't work out, and Pentaweret was labeled a traitor for his efforts, not unlike Man-E. To pile on the similarities, Man-E fits the physical profile of the late, not-so-great prince. And perhaps most damning of all, the Screaming Mummy has similar DNA markers and Y chromosomes to Ramesses III, making this a pretty likely association. Now, we put a lot of blame on Pentaweret and Tai for this attempted regicide. But the truth is, there was a whole ass group of noblemen in cahoots to get rid of Ramesses III. Thanks to a surviving record of their trial, the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, we even know the names of the chief conspirators. Of course, there was that old scamp Tutankhamun, formerly chief of the chamber, who stirred up resentment against the pharaoh. And if Tutankhamun was involved, you just know ex-butler Mezidseret and ex-overseer of the royal harem, Paynak, had their traitorous hands in it too. They even brought scribe Pendua along for the treason. This is textbook Tutankhamun. Ultimately, the plan may not have failed. When the mummy of Ramesses III was examined, It revealed a 7-centimeter wide slash on his throat that went deep to the bone. It does not take a doctor to deduce that he probably didn't die of natural causes. In addition to listing off the co-conspirators, the Judicial Papyrus of Turin also tells us the fate of that double-crossing Pentawerate, the would-be pharaoh. He would eventually be apprehended for colluding with his mother and placed before the royal butlers, who examined him and found him guilty. They left him in his place, where he proceeded to take his own life, possibly becoming the Screaming Mummy. Roll credits on Pentawerate. The running theory of what did the ultimate deed? In 1886, Maspero believed that poison was a real possibility, based on the contraction of the abdomen and stomach, and of course the way his head was thrown back in either excruciating pain or while singing the chorus to Bon Jovi's "Livin' on a Prayer." Another grim footnote hypothesis comes from a chemist who, upon analysis of the body, suggested the man was entombed alive, like in Universal's The Mummy. Despite all the signs pointing toward Man-E's identity as Prince Pentawerate, the dry, dusty fact is we don't really know who he was for sure. But if these rigid remains with the rebel yell aren't that of an Egyptian prince, then who else might he have been? One theory supposes it was a Hittite prince who traveled to Egypt to put the moves on King Tutankhamun's wife. Apparently, someone didn't like that plan, and the prince ended up missing under mysterious circumstances. Scholars never figured out what happened to him, but some doubt his fate would match Man-E's, since they wouldn't have even bothered mummifying that guy. If you hit on the pharaoh's wife, you don't get a spot in the pyramid. They just never find you, which is exactly what happened to this guy. So again, he's probably not the Screaming Mummy. Still, others believe he may have been an influential Egyptian who died abroad, and his mummification was done by a foreign crew, whose quality control wasn't quite as good as Egypt's. This is strangely plausible, considering the Screaming Mummy was essentially thrown into his wrappings like a DoorDash order. Getting healthcare out of network is always a pain. At first glance of this horror show of a cadaver, one might think this guy spent the last few moments of his life screaming like he stubbed his toe on the Great Pyramid. Whatever happened, this guy's suffering must have been excruciating, right? Well, sorry to ruin everyone's schadenfreude, but as it turns out, his head likely fell back after he passed, causing the jaw to fall open post-mortem. This natural happenstance ended up giving Man-E the appearance of screaming for all eternity. Today's Weird History brought to you by Gravity. Thanks, Gravity. While this Screaming Mummy was discovered in Egypt, a veritable chorus of dusty mummies with mouths agape can be found all over the world. So you have options when choosing a Screaming Mummy that's right for you. Mummies with faces twisted in a permanent shout can be found from Sicily to Peru, or in Mexico, where one museum boasts over 111 screaming mummies. Heck, Man-E isn't even the only one shouting throughout the afterlife in Egypt, as countless other Egyptian mummies have been discovered sharing the same expression on their faces. This is all just due to how the body works after you die. As the joints holding your jaw in place start to slack, the jaw gapes open and freezes due to rigor mortis. What's left behind are corporeal remains that could be confused for that one skeleton in Poltergeist, which was a real skeleton, but there's no word on whether it was also a mummy at some point. Back to 2011, Northeast Africa was rocked by the Egyptian Revolution. As a result, much of the country's cultural heritage came under fire. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo was not immune to these attacks, and suffered a number of losses during the scuffles. While many priceless artifacts from the museum were stolen or destroyed, and many mummies were wrecked, Dr. Zahi Hawass reported that the Screaming Mummy was completely left alone. Probably because if any of these stiffs were carrying a curse, it would have been the one silently screaming into the void. And who needs that following them around for all eternity? So what do you think? Would you like to take a trip to Egypt to visit Man-E? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our Weird History.